William Wordsworth once described Grasmere village as the loveliest spot that man hath ever found. I read this anecdote of my uncle, Kenneth Abrams, who with his young family arrived in the Lake District in 1966 as a practicing Wordsworth scholar on a State University of New York research grant. My Uncle Ken's doctoral dissertation was on Wordsworth, and he had worked with M.H. Abrams as a graduate student and a research assistant at Cornell University. He and his family had taken up residence in Grasmere, so he could immerse himself in the works of the poet. For Wordsworth 250, Uncle Ken shared this short tale of over 50 years ago, about that time in his life. John Finch, who had been a fellow graduate student at Cornell, and I spent most of the summer days among the manuscripts housed in the Wordsworth Library. John had initially introduced me to Jonathan Wordsworth, a great-great-great-nephew of the poet. John, Jonathan, and his family, and our family, spent many memorable times together, including a trek and overnight at their remote summer cottage. John also suggested that it would be nice for my wife, Madeline, and me to meet the poet's great-great-granddaughter, Dorothy Dickson, who lived nearby in Rydal. Soon afterwards, we met Mrs. Dickson at a tea shop near where she lived between Grasmere and Ambleside. At that very enjoyable first meeting, she enthusiastically invited our family to visit her the next week. Arriving at her lovely home, overlooking the River Rothay, we were delighted and excited to introduce Mrs. Dickson to our daughters, 8-year-old Pamela and 4-year-old Ursula. As we settled in her sitting room, Madeline and I had some trepidation about our children's ability to handle a formal tea. When Mrs. Dickson and her helper brought out the tea set and told us that it had belonged to Dora Wordsworth, the poet's daughter, we were simultaneously thrilled and unnerved, as the lovely china set was in front of our children. Pamela had proven her maturity in our research project by scouting my Wordsworth texts for editorial variants, but this was an elevated occasion for her, as it certainly was for Ursula, who was high-spirited and restless. Dora's teapot had seen service over centuries, and our daughters behaved accordingly as if they were bred for this afternoon tea. Afterwards, Mrs. Dickson suggested we go for an outing. We followed her through the front door and across the lane to the river bank. We approached the edge of the Rothay and a set of large stepping stones that led to the far side. Mrs. Dickson stopped and offered the children a challenge. The girls must attempt to cross the river on the stepping stones, then turn and come back on them over the water. As an incentive, she offered them a shiny coin if they could accomplish the feat unaided, adding that their fine dresses must remain neat and dry. We watched as they carefully crossed and returned without getting a drop of water on them. Each received her special reward for the accomplishment. Madeline and I smiled, and once again took deep breaths. We all had passed our tests, feeling enriched by our newfound friendship with the poet's great-great-granddaughter. Wordsworth's world surrounded us that summer. He had lived in Grasmere and then later in Rydal from 1813 to 1850, where he died. The tea shop in Rydal became our favorite stopping place, especially when Dorothy Dickson met us there. As decades pass and some specifics fade, this one does not. During that memorable time, Mrs. Dickson came to love us as we loved her.